I have been asked, in the 11 years since that afternoon on Vareth platform, whether I knew what Darren was before the Givari came, whether I had assembled the picture and simply kept quiet, whether a C-Thrani female marrying a Class 13 Deathworld human was the kind of careful strategic decision that my species is known for making, with our long view and our careful records and our preference for knowing the outcome of a thing before we commit ourselves to it. The honest answer is no. Or rather, the honest answer is that I had the pieces and never thought to count them. That is the thing I find hardest to explain to other C-Thrani who would have counted, who would have made a spreadsheet. I looked at Darren Cale for 11 years and saw the man I had married, and every piece of him that didn't fit the picture I had, I simply put in a corner and called it one of his quirks. The way he always sat with his back to a wall. The way he woke up at 3/5 past the 4th cycle mark without an alarm, every single time. The way he could walk into a room full of strangers and in 30 seconds know which two people in it were likely to cause trouble, not by observing them, or not only by observing them, but by some quality of attention that I don't have a word for in C-Thrani, and that I have since learned humans don't always have a word for either. There were other pieces. The way he moved through a crowded corridor without ever colliding with anyone, without ever adjusting his path in a visible or reactive way, as though he had simply already accounted for where everyone was going to be. The way he watched exits. Not conspicuously, not the way a nervous person watches exits, craning and returning, but in the manner of someone who had noted them on arrival and filed the information away as a matter of course, the way you might note the restroom location when you come into a restaurant. Useful later, possibly. Noted now. The way, when we were once caught in a transport malfunction on the Vel Athar ring, and were standing in a car that had stopped between stations for 40 minutes, he had said, very quietly and without any apparent distress, "If it comes to it, we can get out through the maintenance panel at the floor junction. It's a standard C-Thrani manufacture hatch, 12 turns counterclockwise," and then had gone back to his reading. I had not asked how he knew that. I had filed it as a Darren thing. These were just Darren things. The way he fixed things, the way he listened, the way he laughed at problems that would have exhausted me because he could already see the shape of the solution from 3 moves out. I had the pieces. We had been on Vareth platform for 7 months when the Givari arrived. Vareth is a mid-tier transit hub, Class 3 commercial, mixed species, the kind of place where 14 different species share a docking ring and manage their differences through a robust system of corridor assignments and meal cycle scheduling, and a platform authority with very clear guidelines about which disputes rise to the level of formal grievance, and which get handled in the back of Bay 11 with a handshake and a discretion agreement. Darren worked maintenance. He had a contractor badge that said systems, general, and a toolkit that he wore on a belt harness, and a reputation, by the 7th month, for being the person you called when the problem was complicated in ways that other maintenance contractors preferred not to think about. The platform director, a Veeth female named Saravel Oth who had run Vareth for 16 years and who I liked very much, told me once that Darren was the best repair person she had ever contracted. Not the fastest, not the most credentialed, but the one who looked at a broken system and saw what had actually broken, rather than what appeared to have broken. She said it made him very useful in emergencies. I remember thinking that was a nice thing to say about someone. The Givari Compliance Bureau operates under a 7th corridor charter that gives it authority to pursue contested debt claims across most of the platforms in the middle transit band. They are, as a species, mottled pale, a gray-white that suggests something left too long in standing water, with bioluminescent patches along the upper mantle that cycle through colors depending on their emotional state. In a social context, this is probably very useful. In a debt enforcement context, it makes them easy to read, if you know what the colors mean. Yellow-green at the margins means irritation. Deep amber in the center pulse means serious intent. They travel in groups of 5 or 6, and they carry the legal equivalent of a battering ram, which is a 7th corridor standard compliance order, and they use it the way that species with battering rams tend to use them. There were 5 of them. They docked in Bay 12 at the start of the second meal cycle on a 5-day, which is not an accident. The second meal cycle is when foot traffic in the main corridor is highest, and the platform authority desk is at minimum staffing because the duty officer is on break. I only know this because Darren pointed it out to me later. At the time, I simply noted their arrival on the station's public berth manifest the way you note the weather. A compliance bureau vessel. Bay 12. Standard docking fee. They had a claim number and a responding party reference code, and when I looked up the claim number, I saw it was attached to a cargo dispute involving a Varath freight contractor. A contested 7-container shipment that had been sitting in adjudication for 4 cycles, which is the kind of thing that happens on stations and usually resolves itself. I did not think it had anything to do with us. The reason it had anything to do with us is a long story that I did not know at the time, and that I will shorten here. The Varath freight contractor whose cargo was disputed was a sublessee of a cargo bay whose primary lease was held by an entity whose registered agent was a shell company that had been, at some point, partly capitalized by a bond instrument that listed as a co-signatory the station maintenance contractor license of a company called Kalesoth Transit Systems, which Darren had formed 12 years ago on Varath Station with a partner who had since dissolved their arrangement. Darren had done everything correctly. He had filed the dissolution papers. He had terminated his interest in the bond instrument. He had closed the license. Every single piece of paper existed somewhere in the Bureau's own files. But the Bureau's claim engine had not connected them, and so when the debt went into enforcement, his name appeared on the respondent list. He found out 3 days before the Givari arrived. He told me about it over dinner, in the matter-of-fact way that he handled most administrative problems, and said he had already filed a correction with the platform authority and was waiting on confirmation. He did not seem worried. I asked him if he was worried, and he said no. He said the paperwork was clean and the claim was obviously erroneous, and these things corrected themselves. I believed him. I have thought about this a great deal since. He was not lying to me. The paperwork was clean. The claim was obviously erroneous, and I believe he genuinely expected it to correct itself, because in his experience, when you did everything correctly, the system worked. What he did not factor in, what I think he had genuinely not considered, or considered and set aside, was that the Givari Compliance Bureau, when it has a name on a respondent list and a ship in the dock and 5 agents already paid to make the trip, does not always wait for the correction to arrive before it moves. I was in our quarters when the alert came through on the station mesh. It was a platform authority notification, the kind that goes to all residents in a disputed party corridor. Compliance Bureau activity in progress, Corridor 14 South, residents advised to clear the pathway, which I read and registered and then mostly dismissed, because I had seen similar notices before, and they almost always resolved into 3 people standing in a corridor having an increasingly formal conversation, while 2 others took inventory of something in an attached bay. What I did not dismiss was the secondary alert that came 4 minutes later, flagged to my personal address. Respondent notice, KELSOTH Transit SYSTEMS, active enforcement, personal appearance required. I sat with that for a moment. Then I sent Darren a message on the mesh. He replied in under 10 seconds. He said, "I see it. Don't come to 14 South. I'm handling it." I want to be clear about what I did next, because it does not reflect well on me as a rational adult member of a species that prides itself on careful decision-making. What I did was put on my jacket and walk to 14 South. I told myself I was going because I was his wife, and the claim was in part a product of our joint residence on Varath, and I had a legitimate interest in how it was handled. This is technically accurate. But if I am being honest, I went because I wanted to see what Darren looked like when he was handling something. Because in 11 years of marriage, I had never seen him handle anything larger than a broken coolant seal and a disputed restaurant bill. And I had begun, in the 4 minutes since reading the compliance notice, to feel something I didn't have a name for. Not fear, something adjacent to it, a kind of pressure in the chest that made me want to close the distance between us. Corridor 14 South is one of the longer stretches on Vareth's residential commercial ring, about 90 meters of pale composite decking with bay hatches on the south wall and resident cabin doors on the north, lit by overhead panels that cycle between blue-white and warm amber depending on the time of day. At the second meal cycle it was blue-white. There was foot traffic, or there had been. By the time I got there, most of it had cleared. The kind of clearing that happens when people look at 5 Givari compliance agents and the legal hardware they're carrying and decide that they have somewhere else to be. Darren was standing near the midpoint of the corridor. He had his toolkit with him, which told me he had come from an active job, the belt harness, a thermal patch scanner hanging from a clip, a secondary pouch with sealed fasteners. He was wearing the gray contractor coveralls that he wore to work and had rolled his sleeves to the elbow, which he did when it was warm or when he was concentrating. He did not look like a man handling an enforcement action. He looked like a man who had stopped on his way back from a job to speak with 5 people he had not arranged to meet. The lead Givari was a large specimen, upper mantle wider than my shoulder span, bioluminescent patches cycling between yellow-green and something deeper. She had her standard compliance terminal out and was speaking at a cadence that I recognized as the formal enforcement register. Slow, declarative, each clause its own complete unit, the way lawyers speak when they want the words to be unambiguous in any subsequent filing. 3 of her colleagues were fanned in a loose arc behind her. The 5th was at a position closer to the bay hatches, a few meters to Darren's right, and was not looking at Darren. She was looking at the corridor in both directions. Which is the kind of thing you do when you are not the one doing the speaking. I noted this at the time. I noted it in the way you note a detail that doesn't quite fit and then set it aside because the main event is happening in front of you. I have thought about it a lot since. The 4th and 3rd agents had taken up positions that were, in retrospect, also not incidental. They stood at angles that divided the corridor into sections. Not blocking exits, there were no obstructions, technically, you could have walked past them with minimal difficulty, but positioned such that you would have to choose to walk past them. Such that walking past them would be a decision, and one they could observe. I didn't parse this at the time. I parsed the lead agent and the lead agent's conversation. I noted the 5th's position as a peripheral detail, and I filed it and moved on. This is something I have had to reckon with since, that even watching the whole thing unfold, I was not processing the geometry of it the way that Darren was. The lead agent was telling me where to look. Darren was looking at everything else. Darren was talking. Not loudly, I couldn't hear him yet at that distance, but with a quality of patience that I knew very well. It is the voice he uses with machinery that is not cooperating, and with people who are not cooperating for the same reason that machinery doesn't cooperate, which is that they don't have the information they need to behave differently. It is a voice that is entirely without frustration, because it has already accounted for the frustration and moved past it to the question of how to get from here to where things are actually working. I walked closer, not into the enforcement space. I had enough sense for that, but close enough to hear. The lead Givari had her compliance terminal held out in front of her, the screen facing Darren, which is the enforcement posture. It means, this is what the record says, and I am showing it to you so that you understand that I am working from a document and not from personal preference. Darren had his hands at his sides, not tense, just still. His toolkit belt had settled slightly forward on his left hip from the walkover, and he hadn't adjusted it, and I remember noticing that and thinking, he doesn't fidget. He really doesn't fidget. I had known this. I had simply never thought about what it meant. The dissolution paperwork is in your bureau's own archive, he was saying. The reference number is VK14-SOTH 2019 closure. If you pull that file, the interest termination is dated 14 months before the bond default. I'm not a correspondent. I was never a correspondent. The claim engine picked up a lapsed reference and didn't cross-check the termination date. The lead Givari said something I didn't catch, a formal clause, slow and declarative. Darren said, I understand that. I'm asking you to check the file before we continue. She said something else. Darren said, I hear you. The order is valid if the interest is current. I'm telling you the interest was terminated 14 months before the bond default, which means it isn't current, which means the order doesn't cover me. That's not my legal interpretation. That's the statute. You can read it on the same terminal you have open right now. This went on for a while. I watched it the way you watch a machine operating correctly, each piece doing what it was supposed to do, the whole thing moving forward. Darren was patient and exact and produced information in the right sequence, and the lead Givari's bioluminescent patches shifted through several colors that I was later able to identify as irritation, reassessment, further irritation, reluctant consideration. She was making calls. She was pulling files. The process was grinding along the way processes grind, when someone with clean paperwork meets someone whose system hasn't caught up with the paperwork yet. And then the fifth Givari moved. She had been standing at the bay hatch position, looking at the corridor in both directions. Now she took 3 steps toward me. I didn't understand what she was doing at first. I was not in the enforcement space. I had not announced myself as a party to anything. I was standing against the north wall of the corridor, 11 meters from the midpoint of the action, watching my husband explain a filing error. She said in the formal enforcement register, identity and respondent status. I said, Velmaren Soth, I'm not a party to this action. She said, joint residential registration, Varath platform, quarters 14 North 7. You are co-registered with KL Soth respondent. Compliance procedure requires identification of all co-registered residents. I said, we share quarters. That's not an interest in the company. She said, joint residential status triggers a co-identification requirement under 7th Corridor Compliance Code, Section 9, Paragraph 4. I need you to step into the compliance space. I looked at her. I looked at the compliance space, which was the loose arc of Givari agents between me and Darren, which was not a physical boundary but was clearly intended to function as one. And I felt, quite clearly, that I did not want to step into it, not because I was afraid of what would happen to me, because something about the geometry of the situation had changed in a way I didn't understand. I said, is that a formal order? She said, it is a formal request under compliance procedure. Non-compliance with a formal request may constitute obstruction. And before I could answer, Darren said quietly, with the same patience, not loudly at all, she's not stepping into the compliance space. The fifth Givari looked at him. He was still facing the lead agent. He hadn't turned. He said, the co-identification requirement in Section 9 applies to registered business interests, not residential co-registrations. Read the statute, Paragraph 4, last clause. The fifth Givari's bioluminescent patches went amber. The lead Givari looked at Darren. Then she looked at the fifth. Then she said something in the Givari frequency band that I could hear as sound but couldn't parse as language. I know what it meant now. I found a translation resource afterward and looked it up. What she said was approximately, close the north exit and hold the secondary. I didn't know that then. What I knew was that 2 of the 3 agents in the arc behind the lead Givari began moving, not toward Darren, not directly, but in directions that were consistent with repositioning, and that the 5th Givari had not moved away from me. I know what I looked like in that moment. I have a clear memory of it from outside myself, which is the kind of memory you get when something sharpens you past the point of ordinary processing. I was standing against the north wall of Corridor 14 South, 11 meters from my husband, with a Givari compliance agent between us. My secondary manipulator limbs had tucked against my sides the way they do when I'm not sure where to put them. My double pupils were probably very wide. Darren turned around. I want to try to describe this accurately, because I have spent a great deal of time since that afternoon trying to understand what changed when he turned around, and I'm not sure I have the right words for it yet. He turned around the way he always turned around, not fast, not dramatically, not in any way that was marked. But when he was facing us rather than the lead Givari, something was different about the corridor. Not the lighting, not the geometry, some quality of the space. Like a pressure change, you feel in your inner ear before you can name the source. He looked at the fifth Givari. He looked at the two agents who had repositioned. He looked at me. His expression did not change. His face was the same face it always was, the one I had been looking at for 11 years, the lines around the eyes, the slight set of the jaw. He was not angry. I want to be very clear about that. He was not angry at all. The temperature of his face was exactly what it always was. What had changed was something else, something underneath that, something that I realized in that moment had always been there, and that I had simply never had occasion to see before. He was done calculating. He had already run the numbers. He knew where everyone was in the corridor, knew the distance between himself and each of them, knew the distance between each of them and me, and had already decided in whatever time it takes to turn around what was going to happen next and in what sequence. I didn't know that in words. I knew it the way you know a physical fact, pressure change, temperature drop. I knew it the way the fifth Givari's bioluminescent patches went from amber to a color I had never seen before and have since identified as the Givari expression for threat reassessment required. He said, still in that same patient voice, without emphasis, "Move away from my wife." The fifth Givari said, "Compliance procedure requires." Darren said, "I understand the procedure. Move away from my wife." The fifth Givari did not move. What happened after that took approximately 40 seconds, and I am going to describe it as accurately as I can, which is to say imperfectly, because there is a gap in my processing of those 40 seconds that I can only describe as the gap between watching something happen and understanding what you watched. The pieces are all there. The sequence is clear. What I don't fully have is the moment-by-moment comprehension that I would normally have, because my comprehension was running several cycles behind events. Darren walked toward the fifth Givari. He walked at a normal pace. He did not run. He did not change his posture. He had his toolkit belt on and his sleeves rolled, and he walked the way he walked everywhere, which is with the slightly forward lean that tall humans have, the center of gravity ahead of the feet, the way something moves that is accustomed to covering ground. The fifth Givari reached for the restraint tool on her compliance harness. Darren's right hand was already at the restraint tool before the agent's hand got there. Not grabbing for it, but positioned such that getting to it was no longer a simple action. His left hand went to the agent's upper mantle secondary tentacle cluster. Not hard, not brutally, with a very specific and very deliberate pressure at a specific location. And the fifth Givari made a sound that I had never heard a Givari make before, and her bioluminescent patches went completely dark. The two repositioned agents moved. I watched what happened next the way I have since watched recordings of it on the Platform Authority incident feed, which is to say I watched something that looked, if you were not paying close attention, almost like a maintenance contractor walking across a corridor while things fell down around him. He moved through the space. He used very little of it. The tool belt swung once and he caught it with his left hand without looking at it, and then it stopped swinging, and one of the repositioned agents went into the wall with a sound that was not quite a crash, because most of the force was absorbed by the agent rather than the wall, and the other one stopped. Just stopped. Whatever Darren had said to her, I didn't catch it. He had spoken quietly and I was 11 meters away and my audio processing was not working well. She stopped and stayed stopped. The lead Givari had her compliance terminal out and had not moved. Her bioluminescent patches were doing something I could not parse. She was looking at Darren. Darren looked back at her. He said, "You have one agent who needs a medic for her secondary cluster. She'll be fine in about an hour. It's a pressure reaction, not structural damage. You have one agent against the wall who I'd like you to check on when this is done. You have one agent standing still. And you have me." The lead Givari said nothing. Darren said, "The claim is erroneous. The paperwork is in your archive under VK14-SOTH 2019 closure. I am not a correspondent. We are going to process the correction, and then your crew is going to take their vessel out of Bay 12, and then I am going to go back to my quarters and finish dinner." A pause. Or he said, "You can escalate this. That's also a choice." His bioluminescent patches, he doesn't have any, he's human, but if he had had them I think they would have been the color that means. I have already solved this, and the solution I chose was the easy one. The lead Givari put down her compliance terminal. Not dropped it, put it down, carefully. On the flat top of an equipment brace on the south wall, the way you put something down when you want both hands free and also want the gesture to mean something. Then she pulled up the archive on her secondary interface and entered a reference number. I watched her read it. The color her bioluminescent patches went was one I could read clearly, even then, even with my processing running slow. It was the color that means. I have found the document, and the document says what he told me it would say. She looked at Darren for a long moment. Then she went and checked on the agent against the wall. I went to Darren. I don't know what I was expecting to find when I got to him. Some sign of what had just happened, maybe. Some marker on his face or in his posture that would give me something to hold on to. But he was exactly what he always was, the same face, the same slight set of the jaw, the toolkit belt settled back on his hip where it had always sat. He looked at me the way he always looked at me, when I did something he had asked me not to do, which is with a patience that has long since moved past frustration into a kind of fond exasperation. He said, "I told you not to come." I said, "I know." He said, "Are you all right?" I said, "I don't know yet." He nodded. He looked at the corridor, at the lead Givari and her crew, at the agent sitting against the south wall who was already getting some color back in her patches, at the one standing still who was still standing still. He looked at it all the way he looked at a system that had broken in a complicated way and was now in the process of being repaired. Then he said, "Come on, I'll make tea." We walked back to quarters 14 North 7. He keyed the door. He went to the galley and filled the heating unit and pulled out 2 cups, the wide sea-throny cups that he had bought for me in the market in Vel Athar 3 years ago, because he had noticed I prefer a wider rim, and he set them on the counter and waited for the water to heat. I sat on the bench by the window. Outside the window was the station ring and the traffic lanes and the distant glint of ships in the outer dock, the same view I'd had for 7 months, the same blue-white light of the second meal cycle. I looked at my husband standing in our galley making tea. I want to be careful about what I say next, because I have said it wrong before. I said it wrong the first time I tried to tell it, which was to a colleague at my research station about 6 months after the Vareth incident, and she heard what I said and looked at me with an expression that I understood to mean, "You did not know what you had married." I have been trying to correct that impression ever since, because it is not what I mean. I knew what I had married. I had married Darren Cale, who was patient and exact and good at fixing things, who bought me sea-throny cups in a market on Vel Athar and made tea when things were difficult and sat with his back to walls. I had married the man who looked at a broken system and saw what had actually broken rather than what appeared to have broken. The man who, when I had a difficult call with my family, came and sat next to me without being asked, and didn't say anything and didn't have to. The man who laughed at problems and worked through them with the same quality of attention, whether the problem was a coolant seal or a corridor full of debt enforcement agents. What I had not known, or rather, what I had not assembled into a picture, was what that quality of attention actually was, what it came from, what it meant. The Platform Authority Incident Report, which I read in full about 2 weeks later, describes the 40 seconds in Corridor 14 South in the following terms. Respondent Subject KAEL, D executed physical response to perceived threat against co-registered residential party. Injury Summary. GHEVARI Compliance Agent 5, Secondary Tentacle Cluster Pressure Incident, no structural damage, resolved without medical intervention. GHEVARI Compliance Agent 3, Wall Contact, Contusion to Upper Mantle Minor. Claim Status Corrected. Bureau Citation, Erroneous Respondent Inclusion, Archive Ref VK14-SOTH 2019 Closure. No CHARGES filed. Case closed. That is the official version. The unofficial version, the one that traveled through the station mesh in the way that stories travel on a mid-tier transit hub, in pieces that get assembled and reassembled until something close to the truth emerges, was that the maintenance contractor in Bay 14 South had moved through 5 Gavari enforcement agents in under a minute and nobody had needed a hospital, and the Gavari had filed a corrected claim and left on their own. Soravel Ath called me into her office 4 days later. She offered me a beverage from her personal supply, which is the Veith equivalent of a significant gesture, and she sat behind her desk and looked at me for a moment and then said, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to know that I am asking out of professional interest and not personal." I said, "All right." She said, "When you married Darren Cale, did you know what his homeworld classification was?" I said, "I knew he was from a high classification world. He mentioned it when we were first introduced. I didn't know the specific number." She said, "The Platform Authority did a background review after the incident. His homeworld classification is 13. I looked at her. She said, "Class 13 death worlds are environments where the baseline survival demands on the native fauna, the parasitic load, the atmospheric variance, the gravitational stress, the predator-to-prey ratio, exceed, on average, by roughly 900% what any species on this station was designed to handle. Class 13 is not a category that the standard compliance code was written to account for." I said, "He was a contractor. His work certification said Systems General." She said, "Yes, it did." There was a pause. She said, "I want to be clear that I am not raising this as a complaint. I am raising it because I would like to understand something. In the time you have been on Varath, 7 months, he has been my most reliable contractor. He has not caused a single incident. He has been by every measure what his badge says he is. Systems General, quiet, thorough, kind." I said, "Yes." She said, "Did you ever see in 11 years, did you ever see him be anything else?" I thought about that. I thought about 11 years, about the quality of attention, about the wall sitting and the 3/5 cycle waking, and the way he looked at a room full of strangers and knew in 30 seconds which 2 people were likely to cause trouble. I said, "I think I always saw him be exactly what he is. I just didn't know what it was called." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The Gavari lead agent filed a supplementary note to the Platform Authority along with the corrected claim." She said, and I'm reading this from the document, she said her crew encountered a respondent subject who was cooperative and professionally courteous throughout the initial interaction, and who responded with appropriate and proportionate force when a co-registered residential party was placed in an adversarial position. She recommends no action against the respondent subject. She looked up from the document. Appropriate and proportionate, she said. I said, he didn't hurt them badly. She said, no, he didn't. She set the document down. In my 16 years running this platform, I have seen a great deal of compliance enforcement. Most of it goes badly in one direction or the other. Either the responding party escalates past the Bureau's capacity to manage it, or the Bureau escalates past the point where formal procedure can contain it. What happened in Corridor 14 South went in neither direction. 5 agents, 40 seconds, 1 contusion and 1 pressure reaction and a corrected claim, and everyone walked off the platform on their own legs. She looked at me. He did that on purpose, she said. Not the response, the outcome. He controlled the outcome. I didn't know what to say to that, so I said, he makes tea when things are difficult. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, with what I think was a Veith expression for something between admiration and a kind of reverent unease, yes. I believe he does. I went home. He was in the galley. He had the day off. We had both taken the day off, after the incident, using the paid leave provision in his contractor agreement. And he was making something from a recipe he had found in a Terran food archive that he accessed occasionally, and that produced things which were, by his own admission, about 40% likely to be good and 60% likely to be educational. He was consulting his handwritten notes, and the aromatic output was currently in the educational category. He looked up when I came in. He said, "How was the platform director?" I said, "She told me your homeworld is class 13. He looked back at his notes. He said, "Yeah." I said, "You never mentioned the number." He said, "You never asked." I said, "Is that the same as telling me?" He thought about this. He said, "Probably not, I'm sorry." And then before I could respond to that, he said, "How much did you know?" I sat down on the bench. I said, "I knew you were careful. I knew you always sat with your back to walls. I knew you woke up at the same time every cycle without an alarm. I knew that when you walked into a room, you knew things about it in the first 30 seconds that most people don't know after 30 minutes. He was quiet. I said, "I thought those were Darren things." He looked at me then, the same face, the same lines, the same exact quality of attention. He said, "They are." I thought about that for a while. About what it means to say, "The thing you see is the thing I am." About what it means that the man who moved through 5 compliance agents in 40 seconds is the same man who woke up next to me every morning and bought me Thrani cups in a market in Vel Athar and made tea when things were difficult. Not a mask on one side and the truth on the other. The same person, all the way through. I said, "The Givari agent said appropriate and proportionate." He said, "They weren't trying to hurt you. The one who approached you, she was following procedure. She probably thought you'd come into the compliance space and then the lead agent could use you as a secondary hold to slow down the correction process. It's a standard tactic. But she wasn't going to hurt you." I said, "And if she had been?" He was quiet for a moment, not evasive, thinking about how to say something accurately. He said, "Then it would have been different." I looked at my husband standing in our galley. I thought about 11 years, about every room I had ever watched him walk into, about every problem I had watched him assess and solve. I thought about what the platform director had said. He controlled the outcome, not the response, the outcome. And I thought about the fact that the outcome was 1 contusion, 1 pressure reaction, a corrected filing, 5 agents on their own legs walking back to Bay 12. He had built that outcome. From the position of a man standing in a corridor with a toolkit belt, having a conversation about a paperwork error, he had built the outcome that he wanted, which was everyone alive and standing and the claim corrected, and his wife not in the compliance space. I said, "You built the whole thing." He said, "The claim wasn't erroneous by accident. The Bureau's claim engine has a known gap at the dissolution interest intersection. Somebody should file a formal notice on it." He paused. I'll do it next week. I looked at him. He looked back at me. He said, "Are you all right?" I said, "I've been trying to figure out what you are." He said, "I know. I'm sorry it came up the way it did." I said, "I don't mean it as a complaint. I'm trying to understand something." He waited. I said, "The platform director said Class 13 death worlds exceed the survival demands of everything on this station by 900%. She said the standard compliance code wasn't written to account for it." He said, "That's accurate." I said, "You filed paperwork to run a maintenance company. You built a toolkit belt. You make tea." He said, "Yes." I said, "And you are also the other thing." He said, "Yes." I said, "How long have you been the other thing?" He thought about this for a moment. Then he said, "I was born on a world where the other thing is just survival. You're the other thing before you're old enough to have a word for it. It's not a mode I go into. It's what I am when I need to be." He paused. "Most of the time I don't need to be." I said, 4 years. You said roughly 4 years. He said, "There was a situation on Varath before we came here. A cargo operation that was pressuring an independent freight crew, 2 Seathrani females, running a 2-ship operation without enough margin to absorb that kind of problem. I was working the same dock ring. I talked to the cargo operation about it." I said, "Talk to them." He said, "Yes." A pause. "They stopped," he said. I looked at him. He said, "The point is, it's not a switch. It doesn't turn on and turn off. But most of the time what a problem needs is not that capacity. Most of the time what a problem needs is knowing the statute, or being patient in a corridor, or fixing the seal the right way the first time. The other thing is like the heaviest tool on the belt. You use it when the fastener needs it." He paused. "Today the fastener needed it." I said, 11 years. He said, 11 years. I said, "I had the pieces." He said very quietly, "I know. I thought about whether to give you the number and I decided not to hide it. Because the number it doesn't tell you much, actually. It's a classification system designed by species who had never met one of us. It describes the world I'm from. It doesn't describe what I am." I thought about that. He said, "What I am is the guy who makes tea." I looked at him for a long time. "Yes," I said finally, "you are." The heating unit chimed. He poured the water. He set the cups on the bench next to me and sat down with his own. The Terran-style straight-sided cup that he had brought with him from Varath Station, and that had a small chip in the rim on one side, and that I had offered to replace 3 times and that he had declined 3 times, because it was the cup he had. We sat there in the quiet of our quarters and drank our tea. The station traffic moved outside the window. The second meal cycle was ending. Somewhere in the dock ring, a Givari compliance vessel was preparing to depart Bay 12. I thought about what it means to know something, about the difference between having the pieces and having the picture. I had watched Darren Cale walk into rooms for 11 years and register them in 30 seconds. I had watched him sit with his back to walls. I had heard the way his voice stayed level when things around him were not. I had seen, in the immediate aftermath of the incident on 14 South, the quality of attention that I had been seeing the whole time and not naming. And I thought about what Saravel Oth had said, that in 16 years of running a mid-tier transit platform, she had never seen an enforcement interaction end the way that one ended, and she had run that platform long enough to see most things. 5 agents, 40 seconds, everyone on their own legs. I thought about the Givari lead agent's supplementary note, cooperative and professionally courteous throughout the initial interaction, appropriate and proportionate force, recommends no action. I thought about the fact that Darren was going to file a formal notice about the gap in the Bureau's claim engine next week, because someone should. I looked at my husband. He was holding his chipped cup with both hands, the way he always did. It's a Terran thermal retention thing. He told me once, you hold the cup to keep it warm or keep your hands warm. He wasn't sure which it was originally, and at this point it didn't matter. And he was watching the traffic outside the window with the same quality of attention he watched everything with. Patient, exact, already knowing, probably, the answer to a question I hadn't asked yet. I said, what would you have done if I'd come into the compliance space? He said, I would have gotten you back out. I said, I know. I mean, would it have been different? He looked at me, not the long, calculating look of the corridor, the other look, the one that had been there the whole time too, that I had been looking at for 11 years across dinner tables and markets and the bench by the window. He said, yes. Then he said, but you didn't. He looked back at the traffic. You stayed where you were, he said. You watched. You gave me room to work. I said, I was 11 meters away. I wasn't sure what I was watching. He said, you were watching me handle it. There was a pause. That's all it was, he said. 11 years of watching me handle things, and today it was a bigger thing. Same method. I thought about that. Same method. The coolant seal and the Givari compliance crew and the disputed restaurant bill and the 5 agents in Corridor 14 South. The same quality of attention. The same patient exactness. The same man, all the way through, from the world that builds things like him and doesn't think to classify them because on that world what he is not remarkable. It is simply what survives. I said, the platform director is going to have questions. He said, I know, I'll talk to her. I said, she's going to want to understand what she has under contract. He said, she already knows. She ran the background check after the incident. She knows the number. A pause. I think she already knew before. She's been running that platform for 16 years. She knows what she's looking at when she sees it. I said, what did she say to you when she talked to you? He said, she asked if the toolkit belt was a deliberate choice. I said, what did you tell her? He said, I told her it was useful for maintenance work. He looked at me. She laughed, he said. I looked at my husband, the man who had walked through Corridor 14 South with a maintenance toolkit and moved 5 compliance agents to the outcome he had decided on, and then came home and made tea. The man who sat with his back to walls and woke at 3/5 past the 4th cycle mark and looked at rooms in a way that registered everything in them. All of it. Every exit and position and potential. Because on the world that built him, that is simply what it means to be alive. The kindest man on the station, people called him. I had heard it said, in those 7 months, by the technician 3 doors down who had borrowed Darren's torque alignment tool and returned it with a bottle of fermented C-Thrani grain spirits as thanks, and by the owner of the cart stall at the corridor junction who always called him by name and gave him extra portion, because he had fixed her cart's temperature unit at no charge on a day when she couldn't afford the service fee. And by the young Veith cadet who lived in the quarters 2 doors from ours and who had come to Darren 6 months ago with a mathematics problem that was making her fail her navigation certification, and who had, after 4 evenings of Darren sitting across from her at our galley table, explaining the same concept 17 different ways, until one of them landed. Passed her certification with the highest mark in her cohort. The kindest man on the station. I poured a second cup. The traffic moved outside the window. The Givari vessel cleared Bay 12 in the early evening, the departure listed on the public berth manifest under status. Departed claim. Corrected respondent status. CLEARED. Darren saw it on his wristband. He checked the mesh occasionally, with the same thoroughness he checked everything, and he looked at it for a moment and then put his wristband down. He said, good. Just that, not triumph, not relief. The same word he used when a coolant seal held pressure after repair, or when a filing came back with the correct notation, or when a problem he had identified resolved itself in the way he had expected it to resolve. Good. I understood in that moment something I should probably have understood before, that for Darren Cale, there was no meaningful difference between a coolant seal that held and 5 agents in a corridor that ended correctly. The method was the same. The standard was the same. You looked at the thing that was broken. You understood what had actually broken, not what appeared to have broken. You fixed it to the level it needed to be fixed and no further, and you moved on. He was already looking at his notes for the Terran Food Archive recipe, checking where it had gone wrong, annotating probably for the next attempt. I said, "What was that smell, by the way?" He said without looking up, "I think I used the wrong heat cycle." "I'll fix it." Outside the window, the Gavari vessel's exhaust trail faded into the traffic lanes. The station continued its routine, the second meal cycle ending, the third beginning, cargo handlers in the outer dock, a Seathrani transport hauling trade goods from Vel Athar, 12 species coexisting on a mid-tier transit hub through a robust system of corridor assignments and meal cycle scheduling, and a maintenance contractor with a chipped cup who sat with his back to walls. I held my tea. I thought I have been asked whether I knew what Darren was. The honest answer is that I knew exactly what he was. I had known for 11 years. I had simply never, until that afternoon, had occasion to see the whole thing at once.